So today we're talking all about compressor sidechain filters. We'll talk about the difference between internal and external, and we'll show you how those filters work, why you would want to know about them, and how you can use them, and what they can do for you in your mix. So let's get on into it. So let's start with clarifying the difference between the internal sidechain and the external. Now, normally when we talk about sidechaining, like sidechaining your bass to your kick drum, so the bass drops out of the way every time the kick drum hits, that's a classic technique, and a lot of times we just refer to that as sidechaining, but that is technically external sidechaining. Because the compressor is on the bass, but the compressor is not listening to the bass, it's listening to an external or outside source, in this case the kick drum, so it's triggered by the kick drum and not by the bass. That's an external sidechain source. An internal sidechain source might be better thought of as a detector, because all compressors have a detector. And if you don't know how to filter the detector, then you're in for a real treat because it's a really useful thing to know. So let's dive into the mind of a compressor and take a look at it from the compressor's point of view. So here's some more loops that I drug out of the library, and this is basically completely unmixed and raw, which is going to be really helpful for this tutorial. So let's take a listen and then we'll hone in on this drum bus here. This loop already has some compression on it, but honestly the compression job wasn't done super well, and if I go to the first part of this loop, it'll be really obvious as to why. Let's take a listen. So what you're hearing there is the compressor that was put on this loop is overreacting to the kick drum. Now listen to the cymbal again as it's fading away, and listen to it duck out or pump a little bit every time the kick drum happens. That pumping effect on the cymbal is because the compressor is listening to the kick drum primarily, and that's not in of itself a problem, but compressors tend to overreact to low frequencies because low frequencies require the most energy to push. So let's take a look at the drum bus and explore that here a little bit. All right, so now we have the compressor reacting to the drum bus, but you can hear what it's doing. It's clamping down pretty hard on the snare and on the cymbals, and let's take a look at why. So all compressors have a detector, and what the detector does is listen to the incoming information. And if you don't adjust the detector, it's listening to the entire thing. So right now this is listening to the entire drum bus just like we are. So from the point of view of the compressor, we're going to use Nova here to take a look at basically this is what the compressor is seeing. And you can see that down here where the bass drum is where there's all the low frequency energy, and that's what the compressor is responding to. So what the internal sidechain filter is, like I said, it can be better thought of as the detection filter. What it does is tell the compressor what to listen to and what not to listen to. So for example, if we were to engage a high-pass filter on this compressor, then the compressor would stop listening to the frequencies that we filter out, and it would look something like this. So when you engage a high-pass filter on a compressor, you can now tell the compressor not to listen to anything below the filter, so it's no longer listening to the kick drum, which is really useful because now the compressor is just going to be listening to what we've left it with, which is the upper end of the snare and the cymbals, so it won't be overreacting to the low information. And if you have a fancy compressor, you'll also have the ability to high pass and low pass in to a specific range. Then this is all the compressor would be listening to. But here's one of the myths that really needs to be dispelled is whatever filtering you do on an internal sidechain does not mean that that's all that's being compressed. The compressor is still going to compress the entire signal. One of the misconceptions that I see about that is people saying that you can hone in on the 5-10K range where the sibilance is on a vocal to make the compressor act more like a de-esser. And it seems to me that some people think that the compressor is not working on the rest of the vocal, and it most certainly is. It's just not reacting to it because it's not listening to it. So if this was a vocal and you get in here on the sibilant range with your internal sidechain filter, yes, you could make it act more like a de-esser, but it's not a de-esser. It's still compressing the entire signal. Now, if you want to compress that region with a dynamic EQ or a multiband compressor, then that is more like de-essing. That is entirely different than the internal sidechain filter on a compressor. So I just wanted to clarify that. So if we want to tell the compressor to listen to everything except for the kick drum, then it won't be overreacting to the kick drum and we won't get the pumping effect on the high mids. So let's do that with this tube compressor. And now the key filter down here, this means the same thing as internal sidechain filter. This is the detector filter. And not all compressors have the same kind of internal sidechain detection filter. This one to me sounds like it's acting more like a bell curve that you could use to tell the compressor what to listen to. So if we're telling the compressor to listen up here around 2K, now we can engage this compressor a lot stronger and it won't be overreacting to the kick drum. The detector filters do not change the input or the output. They just change the detection and what it's listening to. And that's what they mean when they're talking about an internal sidechain filter. It's a detector filter. So now if I put an 1176 on this drum bus, now the high pass filter over here, if I raise this until it's out of the way of the kick drum and get it up, say, around 200 hertz, there's about 180. All of a sudden we have a way smoother compression. We don't have the same amount of gain reduction, but now we can dial it in and get just as much gain reduction with a smoother output. So it's still compressing the kick drum. Just because you high pass the compressor above the kick drum does not mean it's not compressing the kick drum. It is. It's just not reacting to it. So same thing on this acoustic guitar here, which does not sound very good. It has no EQ on it or anything, and that's going to be perfect. Let's hit it with this 1176, and even an acoustic guitar has a lot of low end that compressors tend to overreact to. Now, if you've seen my video on how to mix acoustic guitar, you'll know that this is not typically the way that I recommend, but this is another really good method, similar as a vocal, is you can use an 1176 or something similar, a fast compressor or a gentle limiter to tame the peaks, and then follow it up with a slower, more colored compressor, just like the vocal trick of pairing an 1176 with an LA2A. Let's do that on this acoustic here and show you the internal sidechain filters and how they can help. So if we get a good amount of gain reduction going on here, do a little makeup gain, but it doesn't sound very good because the compressor's hitting the low notes of the acoustic and overreacting to the high mids. But if I raise the high pass filter, we've lost some gain reduction, but it sounds a lot clearer and a lot nicer. So now we can dial in more gain reduction. Let's take it all the way up to 500. So now the compressor is only listening to everything at 500 hertz and above on this acoustic, and we're getting our 6 dB of gain reduction, but the high mids sound a lot smoother. And we'll follow it up with La La here. Just aim for about 3 more dB, and same thing. Now, La La is reacting to the low frequencies, so let's high pass this up to about 500. And then we can get a little more gain reduction out of it. Do a little makeup gain. There we go. And this has a way better effect on the highs and high mids of the acoustic because neither compressor is reacting to the lower frequency information. So we'll turn both compressors off. That's the dry. We'll turn them both back on. There we go. If you get the compressor to not listen to the low frequencies and overreact to them, you can get a smoother result. Now, it's important to point out here that filtering out the low frequencies in your compressor detector is not a magic fix-all. Yes, it can totally reduce the pumping effect from the compressor overreacting to the kick drum, but if the compressor, say, for example, is just reacting to the snare drum primarily, you could create pumping that way as well on the rest of the spectrum. So it's important to know how the filter works and how it might help you, but it doesn't fix every problem. A lot of times what is really helpful is a simple gentle slope on the low end so the compressor is reacting more evenly to the entire spectrum. And you also have to keep in mind that this all depends on the interplay between your attack, release, threshold, and ratio. And to illustrate this point, let's take a look at the Kotelnikov by Tokyo Dawn. This is another awesome free compressor that they offer. And this one offers a slope for the low-end relax. So right now we're getting about 5-6 dB of gain reduction, and you can see that we're getting a nice interplay between peak detection and RMS detection. But now our low-end frequency relax slope is flat. Let's change it to a gentle 6 dB per octave slope here. And look how much gain reduction we lost. We were getting 5-6 dB of gain reduction, but now that the compressor is not reacting as strongly to the low end, we're only getting 1 or 2. So let's clamp down the threshold harder. And you can see how this sounds a little nicer than it did without the slope. But you still have to keep your peak and RMS detection in mind, and you have to keep your attack and release in mind when you're doing something like this. It's still all interplay. You can't just rely on the internal sidechain filter to fix problems for you. You have to keep in mind that when you adjust it, you might have to also adjust your other parameters. For example, if we soften the knee with a little bit slower of an attack, and adjusting the peak release and the RMS release, so now I have a really fast peak release and a slightly faster RMS release. I've lost a little more gain reduction, but I'm getting a more gentler sound on the high end. So you can hear that by adjusting the internal sidechain filter and adding that low detection slope in, so the Kotelnikov was not reacting so strongly to the lower frequencies, we were able to dial in a smoother compression. But the point is here is that when we added in the internal sidechain filter, we had to make adjustments to the attack and release. And it would be similar for a drum bus. It's all dependent on the material. However you're going to compress, there's always a fine-tuning involved. When you start filtering the internal sidechain, you are going to have to make adjustments because the compressor is responding differently. And here's the bass bus. I have the bass split between the low and the high channel. And that way when I sidechain the bass to the kick, I only have to use the compressor to duck out the low part of the bass, so my highs stay unaffected. And if we turn on the drum bus, and here's the compressor on the low part of the bass. Let's turn it on. Now this is set to external sidechain, like we talked about at the beginning. When you sidechain your bass to your kick drum, you want the compressor to listen to an external sidechain source. And I have it filtered here, so the high cut is brought down to 50 Hertz. So if I'm trying to sidechain the bass to a drum bus and I don't use an external sidechain filter, then it's going to listen to the entire drum bus. So it will be ducking out with every drum hit of every snare and the ride and the crash and everything. So I'll turn the filter off and I'm going to turn the highs off the bass. So now we're just listening to the low of the bass and the drum bus, and listen to how erratic this is. So you can see that the bass is pretty much non-existent because that busy drum bus is keeping the bass from having any presence whatsoever. And this is where the external sidechain filter comes in handy. It works the same as an internal sidechain filter. We're just telling the compressor what to listen to. With the filter on, we've taken out everything above 50 Hertz. So the compressor's just listening to the drum bus below 50 Hertz, which is where the kick lives. So what I'm telling that compressor to do is this. It's listening to the drum bus, but when I filter it, the only thing left in that drum bus for the compressor to listen to is the kick drum. So if you've ever tried to sidechain your kick and bass, but you don't have the kick drum as a separate track and you're doing it with a loop, that's how you do it. You get a compressor that has an external sidechain filter, and you filter out everything above the fundamental of the kick drum. And you can see the gold line. That's just the low track of the bass. Duck it out every time the kick hits so we can get a smoother low end. Perfect. But there you have it. I hope that clears up any misconceptions. I definitely wanted to dispel the myth that when you set an internal sidechain on a compressor, that the compressor is only compressing everything that you have it filtered, because that's not true. The compressor's still acting on the whole signal, but what the internal sidechain filter is simply a detection filter telling the compressor what to listen to. And that's super useful for low frequency information. Getting a compressor to not listen to low frequencies can really make your compression job a lot easier. And hopefully you're also getting a bunch of creative ideas and other ways that you could use this that are less conventional. Because being able to tell a compressor what to listen to and what not to listen to opens up a lot of doors in sound design as well. I hope you got a lot out of that. Hope that answered any questions you have. And let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll catch you on the next one.